Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Truth Activist Podcast. In my decade or so of being a health writer and an independent researcher, I have tackled the vaccine industry, the cancer industry, the psychiatric industry, the Botox industry, the cosmetic surgery industry, and all of that was just my warm up act, folks. I didn't know that, you didn't know that, but we know it now. All of this, as it turns out, was just my warm up act for exposing the Christian religion. Yep, that is where I'm going next. It is the topic of my next book that I've been working on for quite a while. It's actually turned out to be the biggest research project I've ever undertaken. I definitely underestimated the sheer volume of information I would need to learn to understand where Christianity came from, why it is the way it is. How did Christian theology develop? These were all the questions I started asking myself when I realized quite a while ago that Christianity didn't come from Jesus. And I started wondering, well, where did it come from then? And how did it become so different than what Jesus taught? Christians don't tend to explore the historicity of their religion or consider how accurate the Gospels are outside of Christian sources, which are very arguably not well researched, not factual. And I know all this because I used to be a Christian. I was a devout Christian for the first part of my life, up until I was 21 and 11 months old. Exactly that. I had a very pivotal moment in my life where I started realizing that the reality presented to me by Christianity was not, in fact, reality, that the concept of God presented to me by Christianity was absolutely not an accurate representation of God. And I started asking some really big questions, questions I've been asking and exploring for a long time. And I'm going to be exploring all of that, sharing all the resources that I've gathered in my upcoming book. And so if you're somebody who is, as one of my friends says, she's Jesus curious, she didn't grow up religious, that might be you. Or maybe you are like me, you grew up in Christianity and then you started to ask some questions that, well, Christians aren't allowed to ask, or at least they're not supposed to answer those questions using sources unapproved by the religious authorities. Because Christianity, like most religion, is very much a religion of just trust the religious experts and follow the theology. And if you veer off the path, well, that's just because Satan has gotten a hold of your mind. So if that is where you came from and you're starting to ask these big questions, or you've left religion because it hurt you, then this book is going to be very informative, very liberating. It is spiritually grounded. It's not from an atheist perspective, although if somebody is an atheist, they're going to get a lot of information out of this book, but I'm not. I simply cannot not believe in a higher power. And I share more of my own spiritual journey in this book than I've shared before. But if you've read The Scorpion and the Lion, then you'll know some of the spiritual experiences that I had that prompted me to question religion. Because in fact, the closer I got to God, the more I started questioning the God that Christianity presented to me. All that to say, I have been immersed in this research and writing project, especially over the summer, and I wanted to share something that I'm going to put into the book on a specific topic of should women be in positions of spiritual leadership? Now, those are words, phrases that if you're a Christian, you'll be well aware of. There is conflict in the Christian religion about whether women should be pastors, and in certain denominations like Baptist denomination, women are not allowed to be in a position of what they call spiritual leadership. they can't be a pastor. And we see this widespread in Catholicism. They don't allow women to be in authoritative positions in the church. Same with the Orthodox position. And this same theme weaves into a lot of Christian teaching about how married couples should live, how people should raise their family. There's a concept in Christianity of female subservience, that women should submit to their husbands. And then, of course, that has some negative overtone. So people will be like, yes, women should submit, but Paul also instructs that men should love their wives like Jesus loved the church. So it's not actually a problem. Like, nobody should have a problem with that because women are just told to submit to those who love them so much. But I want to do a deep dive from both a historical, scriptural perspective. We're going to analyze the biblical scripture that Christians like to use here in this argument. And I'm also going to share my perspective from an emotional, psychological, and spiritual angle, from my own experience and intuitive perception. Of course, you are welcome to disagree with anything that I share. I like to say that some people listen to this podcast merely to be entertained by how crazy Lauren is, and I'm always happy to be of service to a person's entertainment, if that is the case. But I'm also always happy to be of service to a person's awareness of what's been hidden from humanity. And when it comes to Christianity, my friends, there has been so much hidden of a section that I won't put verbatim in the book, but this is going to be a section in the book on this topic of should women be spiritual leaders. Now, Jesus never instructed female submission to men if we look at the Gospels themselves, the 4 canonical Gospels that are in the Bible. In the book, I will do a very deep dive on the historicity, the reliability, the cultural and financial and political influences that shaped the Gospels. A lot of Christians are not aware of that, and it's important to understand. I'm not going to go into that now. I'm just going to meet Christians on the playing field that they use for this argument of female submission, which is scriptural references. I'm not going to start analyzing the applicability of scripture. Okay, let's just meet Christians where they are and start there. As I was saying, Jesus never instructed female submission to men if we're going to assume factual reliability of the canonical Gospels. In fact, we see reports of Jesus interacting with women with egalitarian respect and in such a way that it actually shocked his disciples. And that's discussed, the story of Jesus speaking to the Samaritan woman at the well, which is in John chapter 4. Luke's gospel reports women such as Mary Magdalene and a couple other women funding from their own resources Jesus' ministry and traveling with Jesus. So we know women were supporting him, and that seems like a very egalitarian connection, right? A business partner in a way. We can look at the few sections in the Gospels where Jesus advocated against divorce, and it is helpful to have a historical understanding that at the time of Jesus' life, women were not societally protected if they were divorced. They really didn't have finances or owned property outside of marriage. I mean, it was a patriarchal society. So if women were divorced, their choice was to go back to their family or essentially be abandoned. And so many historians and theologians, for that matter, interpret these passages where Jesus is advocating against divorce as actually being a form of Jesus protecting women from the fallout of the patriarchal culture that they lived in. He was like, men do the honorable thing and support these women who can't support themselves. Now, interestingly, from Jesus's egalitarian ministry, somehow we develop a religion that, in some forms, like I mentioned, teaches female subservience to men. It also tends to prescribe unequal modesty rules to women, like covering their heads or wearing skirts, and it often prohibits women from ministry. What happened here? Well, what happened was the epistles of Paul. I'll get more into this in the book, but these Pauline letters, some of which are likely authentic to Paul, some of which are hotly debated as being forgeries attributed to Paul, these were written before the canonical Gospels. So the Gospels were actually written in light of Paul's understanding of Jesus' teaching, and it appears that there's quite a lot of discrepancy between Paul's interpretation of what Jesus taught, and perhaps a very limited knowledge of what Jesus actually taught, and what Jesus taught. Okay, this is a topic that when I got out of Christianity and started looking into this, I was like, wait a minute. This is a huge debate in history and biblical studies, and I had never heard of it sitting in a church pew for 21 years of my life. Why hadn't anyone told me? How much historians have looked into the conflict between the theology and religious perspectives that Paul developed and wrote, and what it appears Jesus actually taught in his lifetime. Because Paul never met Jesus. Paul had a vision of Jesus. Paul says a lot of things about Jesus, right? But they're definitely not words from Jesus' mouth. I mean, we don't have any words from Jesus' mouth. We have the Gospels, which were written at least 3-4 decades after Jesus' death. The Gospels were manuscripts written in Greek by highly literate Greek-speaking individuals, and Jesus taught to very illiterate, poor Aramaic-speaking Jews. Like I said, we're going to get more into that in the book. But this is important basic awareness that everything Christians reference for female subservience comes from Paul. And now what I'm going to get into is it might not even come from Paul. Okay? So the first scripture Christians tend to cite for female subservience and women not being in ministry is 1 Timothy 2:11 through 12. And this says something, let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. Okay, 1 Timothy is one of the 13 Pauline epistles that is considered by many, many scholars, the majority of scholars, to be a forgery. It's a letter attributed to Paul that Paul didn't write. Because when scholars are looking at all of these Pauline epistles, it appears that 7 are consistent in their phrasing, language, word use, and then we have all these anomalies in the other epistles. And so a lot of scholars hypothesize, because that's the best we can do here, make educated guesses, that these are not actually written by Paul, but were written later by people, who knows who, saying that they were Paul. Again, this is so juicy. There's so much to get into, and I just couldn't believe I had been in church for 21 years of my life, and this is really well-known biblical, historical, scholarly topics. Why didn't I hear this in church? Most pastors learn this going through different seminaries. Why don't they tell their congregation? Interesting question, right? Okay, so Christians, if you're listening to this, we have this line that is very likely not from Paul. And it's definitely not from Jesus. Why do you keep referencing it? Why are you using this as a compass for your life? Okay, then we get to another scripture cited, which is 1 Corinthians 14, 34 through 35. That says, "Let women keep silent, for it is not permitted for them to speak, but to be in subjection, just as the law says. But if they wish to learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church." So scholars agree that 1 Corinthians is almost certainly written by Paul. But this verse is interesting. It looks like it is a forged addition to the text. Now, if you want to learn more about how this works, I highly recommend Bart Ehrman's book, Misquoting Jesus. He is a Bible scholar who does a really great job at writing for lay people and not just other scholars. So this is a very readable book, and it's not too confronting for those who are deeply integrated in Christianity, although I think it will open a lot of eyes about how manuscripts, biblical manuscripts, change very significantly over time. And one of the reasons is because scribes made changes. And there were theological agendas that certain Christians had at certain points in history, and those theological agendas changed and they shifted. But the scribes who were copying the biblical manuscripts knew what was to be emphasized or clarified, and they did that. Now, Christians might think, oh, well, surely that means God was in some way sanctioning or sanctifying these changes if they were made at all. That's totally fine to think, but I encourage people to think about this. I never thought about this as a Christian because I didn't know. I didn't consider where the Bible came from, how it was shaped through history, how we got the English versions we have today, and how we got that from the teachings of a Palestinian Jew who spoke Aramaic and spoke to illiterate followers, and somehow those oral traditions were put into Greek manuscripts, and somehow that ended up to be the Bible that we have today. I want to share one quote from Bart Ehrman's book, specifically on the original Pauline letters, not forgeries, but the original Pauline letters, and how Paul discussed women in the church. Because then you can see there's actually a contradiction here. So if you are in a place where your operating instructions for life must be derived from the Bible, I encourage you to consider the fact that we have discrepancies and contradictions clearly between some of the Pauline epistles and then those which are, many scholars would argue, forgeries. So in these forgeries and the scribal edition I've mentioned today, we have a perspective that women should be subordinated to male authority and control. But if we look at a segment that scholars believe truly came from the Apostle Paul, then consider this. So Ehrman writes in Misquoting Jesus, although Paul names more men than women in his letter to the Romans, it is clear that women were seen as in no way inferior to their male counterparts in the church. Paul mentions Phoebe, for example, who was a deacon or minister in the church of Centrace. I cannot pronounce that. And there is Prisca, who, along with her husband Aquila, is responsible for missionary work among the Gentiles and who supports a Christian congregation in her home. So there we can clearly see Paul is mentioning women in leadership positions in this new church. Why do other statements in the Pauline epistles contradict that? And there's a lot more to look at here in terms of how content in the forged Pauline epistle, as scholars would say, contradict what Paul says in his authentic epistles. And then that leads to a whole nother discussion on how Paul's authentic epistles contradict a lot of the things that Jesus actually taught in his own lifetime, and even some conflict between the disciples and Paul, which is in the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles, but a lot of Christians overlook. And this is simply because Christians are not reading the Bible from a historical standpoint, from a perspective of considering, could there be contradictions? Like, it's not that there's bad information in the Bible, because it's just giving us information about historical influences, cultural influences, existing myths and superstitions, woven in with what can we know to be true based on other methods of critical analysis and historical analysis. Now I want to move this discussion to a different approach entirely. This is my observation. This is my intuition, my perspective. Take it or leave it. But this is on the topic of why is it that in certain patriarchal religions, certain strains of Christianity, women have been prohibited from positions of spiritual leadership. I am going to propose that this is actually an inversion of the spiritual order. It's part of the matrix designed to suppress the awakening of humanity. I know that is a big statement, but let me explain further. I've explained in my previous podcasts some of the archetypal differences between masculine and feminine energy. Now, I'm not talking about the difference between women's energy and men's energy. Masculine and feminine energy, I see these as two different opposing flavors of life force, of the force that creates life and nature. Two different flavors of the God force, we could say, although that's going to rub Christians the wrong way because it sounds like a new agey term. I just have to laugh at that. I have to laugh at that because that used to be me. But what's interesting is actually in Christianity, we often see a greater understanding that masculine and feminine energy is different. Women thrive, they tend to thrive with more feminine energy self-expressing. Men tend to thrive with more masculine energy self-expressing. What gets warped in religion and Christianity is when that becomes rigid rules and people are forced to fit into boxes, rather than discover within themselves how much masculine and feminine energy is optimal, healthy, and balanced for them to embody and express. Women tend to be healthier and more balanced when they are embodying more feminine energy than masculine energy, and vice versa. And maybe you have experienced this in your own life. Feminine energy tends to sense what's beyond this five sensory world, what we can see and taste and touch and hear. It is more deeply connected to the intuitive sense and to what's infinite and beyond. And that's because of female biology. The feminine energy instinctively senses the connection between beings and between humanity and nature more acutely, more naturally than masculine energy does. Masculine energy can be much more disconnected. And that's because the female body is tied in instinctively to the cycles of nature around her. We have those cycles in our female bodies. So when a woman is in touch with her feminine energy, she is intuitively tapped into what's beyond the sensory world. She will see it in her dreams, in her visions, in her longings. She will be deeply pulled by a desire for love beyond the love that she might see around her. She will be deeply compelled with this sense that there could be a more loving, sharing, supportive world than the one we currently see. If a man senses this, that is him tuning into his feminine energy. All of this expresses from a woman's body. Her cervix is a biological portal into absolute oneness. It is this metaphor for the portal into infinity. And her womb represents the cauldron from where life comes. And life dissolves back into unity and oneness. Now, because a woman is biologically designed to share her body with another life, with the potential of having a baby, there is a natural proclivity for a woman to lose herself in connection. And whether that's true, whether or not she ever bears a child. Let me describe what I mean by lose herself. So a woman's biology is designed to maintain a deep connection with a child. And I believe to maintain a similar connection with nature and community. A man lacks this biological proclivity to lose himself in connection. He is not biologically oriented to have another person's life and well-being as his highest priority, like a woman's body is. A man has to step into that through his spiritual growth and choosing to lose his ego, to move beyond his ego. It is a man's spiritual journey in this way to learn selflessness, whereas a woman must learn how to find herself, actually choose selfishness, not the ego self, the soul self. As an independent entity, she has to recognize that and establish an identity apart from her lovers, husband, parents, community, and children. That is a woman's archetypal spiritual growth. So this could sound confronting at first, but a woman's emotional maturation focuses more on developing a spiritual selfishness, discovering her independent essence, protecting it, and preserving it. A man's journey to wisdom requires him to develop a spiritual selflessness. So that means a man needs to learn how to devote himself to connection that calls forth deeper honor, honesty, and commitment than he would choose if he was left unattended with his ego. This is why we see this major maturation point and initiation point from boyhood into manhood is commitment to a relationship, commitment to family life, commitment to a job. Some men grow up in age, but they never make that leap. They remain still afraid of commitment, or it feels like a responsibility or an obligation to them. And that's how you know that man has not made that initiation. When a man has made that initiation into spiritual selflessness, he doesn't see commitment and connection as a burden. It is his highest honor. It's what brings him closer to God, and he is so grateful for that. Now I want to talk about what feminine energy looks like imbalanced in a woman, what masculine energy looks like when it's imbalanced in a man. When feminine energy gets hijacked or suppressed, a woman is going to try to control her body and to control nature rather than be in connection with it. A woman who is in control, striving for control, in contrast to a relaxed woman, that's how you know the feminine energy needs to be healed and addressed there. That woman is more likely to be in competition with other women rather than seeing every situation as an opportunity to be more connected to God. It really is that archetypal difference between a woman who sees other women as competition or a woman who sees every other woman as her spiritual sister. A woman with imbalanced feminine energy or suppressed feminine energy is going to seek safety in appeasing and pleasing other people. Whereas when she recognizes and expresses her feminine energy fully, then she realizes her ultimate safety is being a vehicle for God's love, no matter how many people or who she has to piss off to be in service for that. And a woman who starts on that journey, she's going to piss off a lot of people. Yeah, speaking from experience. I'm like, oh boy, who haven't I pissed off at this point? And being a vehicle for divine love in that way, that is the love that ushers in a higher level of consciousness on planet Earth. I've explained feminine energy, what it looks like when it is healthy and when it's imbalanced, and now let's look at masculine energy. Masculine energy is goal-oriented, it's focused and directed. It is focused far more in competition than collaboration and connection. That's part of this goal-oriented aspect. it tends to set its sights on goals in the material world. This is a really important point because without the feminine energy influence, masculine energy cannot see beyond the five sense world. And so without feminine energy influence, a man is just going to have goals that are informed by what we could call the matrix, okay? It requires feminine energy to inform his goals with love, balance, and spiritual expansion. When men have their masculine energy in check, and they have that spiritual energy influence, whether it's from a wife, a daughter, a grandmother, a female mentor, whatever it may be, he's going to use his masculine energy to achieve goals, to bring the invisible, the more beautiful, balanced, harmonious, higher consciousness into the physical plane. And that's the beauty of it. But can you see what's happened in the world today? How we've established powerful industries that strive for money without the guidance of integrity, right? Profit over people, profit over people. And yes, we have women who have been sucked into the matrix rat race, but originally who created this? It was men. It was imbalanced masculine energy, meaning masculine energy without the influence of the guiding feminine energy principles to move it towards love. So it just got trapped in this very, very imbalanced cycle of striving for goals within the physical world, the world that had a lot of unhealthy values in it. In its highest role, the masculine energy is here to protect and serve the divine mission of the feminine. That is how a man supports his own evolution. And it requires feminine energy to show a man his own potential, because the feminine energy is going to see that the masculine can't. For a man to see his own potential, he needs to be tapped into his feminine energy. And what I have seen is when a man has a woman in his life who can see his potential even better than he can, like that is a spiritual gift that many women have. We can see men's potential more clearly than they can. And it is a man's gift to have a woman like that in his life. So it inspires him to direct his energy to achieving world healing goals beyond his current vision. Because if he was left alone to just his masculine energy, he would just strive after the goals within the matrix site, essentially. It's the feminine energy that inspires the masculine to bring things from the realm of possibility and love and harmony and balance and beauty into the realm of actuality. For me, the highest expression of masculine energy can be summed up with this line from The Princess Bride. I love this movie so much. If we look at this scene I'm going to describe, if you consider it through the lens not of man and woman, but of the archetypal masculine and feminine energy. So the famous line from this movie is, the male love interest says to the female love interest, as you wish. And she realizes he's actually saying, I love you. But it is when the masculine energy says to the feminine energy, as you wish. That's its highest expression. It is saying, what you ask of me, I will do, especially if it seems impossible. Because in fulfilling your desire, feminine energy, I fulfill the greatest longing of my own soul, to step into my ability and potential in a way that I can't even comprehend. You are asking me to go beyond myself, my current skill, my current discipline, and it is my honor to be asked. It is an honor that you see more, that I can give more, that I have more in me than I currently see. That's the masculine in its highest potential. That's what it says to the feminine energy. Now we can have this dynamic inside of us, and our world is going to start healing in some major ways when we have this dynamic between men and women. Here's where an important parallel comes in. It is the highest aspect of the feminine energy to say all of that directly to God. So all of that I just said, What you ask of me, I will do, especially if it seems impossible. It is an honor to be asked to go beyond myself, my skill. It's an honor that you see I have more to give. The feminine energy in its potential says that directly to God. There is something in men that tends to find total devotion to God by first devoting himself in service to women, children, and animals, okay? But oftentimes, women don't need that interface. We don't. I don't know what it is. It is a spiritual pattern that has been observed since the beginning of humanity, but the Matrix has tried to hide that from us. Men need to devote themselves in service to God by way of being in service to women, children, and animals. Women devote themselves in service to God directly. Typically, we don't need that interface. We don't need the middleman. Men need women to inspire them, to see their potential, to set an unwavering standard of integrity, nobility, and honor, which at first is going to seem very unpalatable and impossible for men. But there's going to be a part of the men's souls that realizes, oh my gosh, it's an honor to be seen in my potential and to be asked to go beyond my ego and my selfishness. For some men, some are just going to continue to binge out on their ego, but that's no concern of us or to anyone really who's listening to this podcast, because I think it's pretty self-selecting of who listens to this. Now, when masculine energy is hijacked or suppressed, it sees women, children, and animals as objects to be used, rather than as beings to serve, rather than as his source of connection to God and his spiritual initiation in that way. He is going to see women as resources for his ego, to take care of him, to make him look good, rather than seeing them as independent beings to be cherished and protected. That's when a man's masculine energy is hijacked. As I've touched on before, hijacked masculine energy fears responsibility and commitment, no matter to what source, to his family, his wife, or his job, or his growth, or his fitness, whatever it may be, because he sees that as a limitation to his freedom. But when a man is in his healthy masculine energy, he realizes that it's only through discipline and devotion to a higher calling that he's going to find higher levels of freedom, that he's going to experience a new reality in this world. This is why we have hordes of men in this world who go from relationship to relationship, job to job, addiction to addiction. They think that this is a form of freedom, to avoid responsibility and commitment. But actually, they are trapped in experiencing the same patterns, right? It's like waking up on Groundhog Day over and over, but the scenery's a little different. That's what's happening when a man's masculine energy is hijacked. That's the reality he's going to experience. Same dynamics in his life, but his job's different, right? Same struggles in his life, but his girlfriend's different. Same health issues in his life, but his house is different. His car is different, whatever, right? But he doesn't actually have real freedom in his life by devoting himself to that which will call for his transformation. And it is the feminine energy that is going to call for his transformation. So let me just sum up what I have expressed. The feminine energy is naturally oriented to be in service to love. The masculine energy is naturally oriented to be in service to the feminine energy, and by extension, in service to love. In place of love, you could use the term God, oneness, divinity. A Cherokee proverb sums this up really well, and it goes like this. A woman's highest calling is to lead a man to his soul, so as to unite him with Source. Her lowest calling is to seduce, separating man from his soul and leaving him aimlessly wandering. A man's highest calling is to protect woman, so she is free to walk the earth unharmed. Man's lowest calling is to ambush and force his way into the life of a woman. And there's also a saying that goes, women lead in the spiritual world, men lead in the physical world, right? That is the gist of what I have expressed so far. Women's souls serve God. Men's souls serve women. God takes care of everything and everyone from there. With that understanding, let's look at Western culture in particular, and we can see that the most effective and enduring propaganda to breed boys rather than men in our culture, and therefore create the collapse of culture, has to do with this inverting this dynamic. Okay? So we can see a pattern in Western culture particularly, with great help from Christianity and patriarchal religion. Not from Jesus' teachings to clarify, but from Christianity, the institution, man-made theology. What these influences did in Western culture was to suppress women's individuality, making them second-class citizens and teaching them that at their best they were just pretty objects to be desired. If you want to neuter a society, spiritually suppress women. Convince them that they don't have selves to express, but rather that their goal is to help men express themselves. Because when women lose themselves on that deep spiritual level, when they never find themselves, then society just collapses literally. When a woman forgets that she is the spiritual leader for her family and her community, then everyone is lost. A woman cannot lead men to their souls when she is out of touch with her own soul. That manifests when women don't value their own desires, creativity, well-being, intuition, growth, voice, emotional needs. When a woman loses touch with all that, who is left steering the ship of society? Who's left? The male ego is left. And that is what has been steering the ship of society. And now we're experiencing the fallout of that. We can see it all around us. We can see it in the Matrix. It's women's deepest intuitive desires, the part of them that's connected to God, that pulls humanity forward, that evolves consciousness. It is women who build the bridge to the next world because they see, sense, and feel that world, even though it is not manifested in the physical realm. It's women that build that bridge intuitively, psychically, and emotionally first. We're able to point to it. We're able to point to the next world, the kingdom of heaven on earth. And then the men come along and we can say to them, here's what's possible. This is where I'm going to be living. This is where I'm going. You got to meet me here because I'm not going to stay in this old world. And the men who are in participation with the evolution of humanity are going to help build that bridge on the physical plane, the bridge that women have built on the invisible plane. When we have churches and Christian communities saying that women should be in submission to men and that men are the spiritual leaders of the household, that's an inversion of this natural order. That's what we've had in society and why we're in the dire straits we are today. And it is actually satanic. It's satanic theology. Satanism, the theology there, is to invert and corrupt the natural order, what the divine created. So this is one of the deepest infiltrations of darkness in Christianity. Women are told to serve men, but the men are serving their ego because men don't have that bridge directly to the next level of consciousness. That is the feminine energy. Men have shut down the feminine energy within themselves, and then they've shut it down in their woman by suppressing the women. And like I said, the male ego is left completely unattended, steering the ship. And Lord only knows it cannot steer. It's just going to crash. This is how we get the situation that we have today in so many Christian communities where men are serving their ego, women are serving the men's ego, and no one's serving God. But the religious authorities tell them this is how it should be, and you're actually serving God, but it's a total lie. But fortunately, there is an inevitable awakening happening, and as we could assume, women are waking up first. The irony is that women have it worse in these religious environments, and so they actually have more incentive to wake up and get out and experience freedom in the kingdom of heaven faster. And we see that now. And then some men are choosing to follow, and some men are choosing to stay behind in the kingdom of hell that is their ego. In these oppressive environments, in these inverted communities, women are looking around and thinking, I don't have it as good as men. Like, this isn't working for me. I have a part of my soul that is like shaking the bars of its cage to get out and get free, and I can't ignore it anymore. I can't suppress it anymore. So spiritually, it's not working for the men either. They also have their soul shaking and rattling its cage, but it's kind of like the proverbial mouse who's in the trap. The mouse doesn't realize it's in a trap as long as it is munching on the cheese. The women have been trapped, but there's no cheese in there. So they're like, I'm in a trap. Let me get out. The men are in the same trap, but they're still eating the cheese because these communities feed their ego. So there's less incentive for them to look around and see that they are also trapped. But what is happening is that women are breaking free. There is a total exodus out of Christianity right now, especially out of the more patriarchal strains and the inverted communities where they are being told women should not be spiritual leaders. That's where the exodus is starting. It is an exodus. It has actually spawned a whole new vocabulary in the last 5 years in particular, where it's like deconversion, deconstruction, deprogramming, religious trauma, religious abuse. These are all now in the common parlance. There are therapists being trained in this. Because the need is arriving, we now have a language for it. And to clarify, this does not mean there is an exodus away from Jesus' teachings. What I am articulating is that Christianity and Christian theology and doctrine is distinctly separate from the teachings of Jesus. And I'm going to get way into that in my upcoming book. So now let's go back to this dynamic. We have women breaking free, realizing they're in the trap. What is happening to the men? Some of them are going to try to stop the women from breaking free. They're going to say, no, don't break free. It's dangerous out there. You wait a minute. You want to prioritize your desires and your emotions and your sexuality and your well-being and your creativity. Well, that's so selfish of you. How dare you think that you should do that? And these men are saying that because they're selfish. They're the selfish ones, but they're just going to project that on the women. They're going to say things like, oh, you're being a bad example for our kids. You're going to lead to the derailment of society, although the opposite is true, right? You're being irresponsible. A lot of these lines. It is a very archetypal process. But on the flip side, there are a lot of men in these environments who are looking at the woman waking up. And these men are like, oh, I am willing to see the possibility that I've been stuck in a trap. Show me the way out. Like, tell me what this trap looks like. Tell me what you're saying. Help me get out of it. Show me the way to freedom. And that's what we're seeing across the board right now. This is why I say that women are at the helm of the Great Awakening of humanity. And I'm certainly not the only one saying that. That has been said by many, many others before me. But hopefully, as you've listened to this podcast, you can understand why that is. And it has to do with the female biology being more tapped into the feminine energy. And the feminine energy is that which drives the evolution of consciousness on planet Earth. In conclusion, to wrap up this podcast, Christians often claim biblical authority. when they suggest that a woman should submit to a man. Not all Christians say this, but this is theology and doctrine in a good portion of Christian communities. And sadly, this leads to women being used as tools for male ego, and it leaves men left alone with their egos, and the egos start steering the ship of society. However, from a perspective of biblical scholarship, if we are to remain on this playing field of Scripture, the sections that Christians reference for female submission to men are actually forgeries and scribal alterations to the Bible. A woman's spiritual calling is to submit to divinity and never to a man's ego. And in doing that, in her manifestation of feminine energy in that way, she taps into the most powerful, potent, and beautiful force of herself. And it requires a selfishness on her part, a spiritual selfishness, to prioritize her self-expression, her longings, her intuitions, and her desires, because that aspect of herself is actually tapped into the invisible realm, which can help lead humanity out of this current kingdom of hell that male ego has created on earth. And female ego has equally participated, but it can lead us out of that and into the kingdom of heaven on earth. But this shift for a woman to make demands that she moves beyond people-pleasing and acquiescence and meekness. It is a strength of her soul, and it can be done with gentleness and grace and compassion. But it absolutely requires a greater strength than she has embodied in her lifetime. And it just gives me chills when I look around the world and I see women choosing that strength en masse. It is the turning tide right now, and it is the awakening. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Truth Activist Podcast. Be sure to subscribe if you're listening on YouTube or Substack to catch the next episode. And until next time, thank you for being a truth seeker.